Coney. I'm an associate professor of political science here at George Washington University and affiliated with IRES. I am delighted to moderate a book talk by Natalia Forrat, who's joining us from the University of Michigan. Natalia is going to present just an exceptional piece of scholarship, The Social Roots of Authoritarianism, which covers so many different dimensions of Russian politics and sociology, a sociologist by training, but I like that she thinks less of disciplinary lines than most, and we're really looking forward to this interdisciplinary conversation because it touches so many pressing subjects on Russian society and politics more generally. I will stop talking and give the floor to Natalia, who's going to give a brief presentation, say about 20 to 30 minutes, with the broad themes of the book, and then I'll kick off the discussion with a couple leading questions, and then we've got a real informal discussion club among us, so please, we've got about 30 minutes at the end of the talk to dive in any different direction that you'd like to take it. The only thing we ask is that you just introduce yourself, just so we know who's joining us today. But without further ado, Natalia, thanks so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, David.
Oh, I've got a whole biography that I was going to read of you.
Okay. Go ahead.
Natalia is a lecturer at the University of Michigan, and her research focuses on authoritarianism, state-society relations, and social movements. She's the author, obviously, of The Social Roots of Authoritarianism, Oxford 2024, and her other research has appeared in Comparative Politics, Post-Soviet Affairs, and publications by Freedom House. In the past, she was a pre- and doctoral fellow at Stanford CDD-RL, the Kellogg Institute at the University of Notre Dame, and the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies at the University of Michigan. Thanks so much for joining us, and look forward to your talk.
Thank you, David, for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for coming today. So I will present the main argument of my book. And the book is, as you can see, on authoritarianism. And the empirical material for the book is coming from Russia. So authoritarian regimes, as we know, vary more than democracies do. And there are a lot of useful classifications out there that mostly focus on the structure of the regime or on the groups that hold power. So what I do in this book is I turn our attention towards societies where authoritarian regimes develop. And I claim that different social norms lead to the formation of authoritarian regimes with opposite qualities. So I argue that the key question to understand how authoritarian power works at the grassroots is how people view the state. And there are two basic answers to this question. One, in what I call statist societies, people view the state as their team leader. And in what I call anti-statist societies, people view the state as an outsider at best or a predator at worst, not as their team leader. So this is not the question of whether people like the state. So people may think that this current ruler is a really lousy team leader, but they still believe that the state should be the team leader. So that's the difference of what is expected of the state. Autocrats who happen to rule these different societies must use different tools to build and consolidate authoritarian regimes. In statist societies, they rely on teamwork logic, and they build top-down organizations that penetrate society. And in anti-statist societies, they rely on utility maximization logic, and they build bottom-up clientelistic networks with multiple layers of brokers. So these are two ideal models, and there is obviously a continuum in between. But I think juxtaposing these two models and analyzing them is really useful for understanding the differences between inherently competitive authoritarian regimes such as Venezuela, for example, and inherently non-competitive ones such as Russia or China. So this is the crux of the theoretical argument that I'm going to talk through today, and that is developed in the book. The empirical material, as I said, is based on the comparison of 4 Russian regions. The regions are the Kemerovo region, the Republic of Tatarstan, the Rostov region, and the Republic of Altai. To pick these regions, I used nested analysis design, which means that I did quantitative analysis first, and then I picked the regions to explore the unexplained variation from this quantitative analysis. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time today to go into details of my quantitative analysis, but what is useful to know is that I picked 2 regions above my regression line that had more reliable political machines than my analysis predicted. And then I picked 2 regions below the line that had less reliable political machines than my analysis predicted. So I I visited all 4 regions. I did field work in all of them to understand where this variation comes from. And the main takeaway of that field work was that people in the regions above the line and the regions below the line viewed the state differently. And because of that, they had different kinds of political machines. So in the regions above the line, those where political machines were more reliable and electoral performance was more stable, people viewed the state as their team leader. So when state officials reached out to them with a request of some kind of public project, usually people's reaction was, okay, let's do it. So the state was seen as working for the public good, and people considered it kind of their duty to help the state. And even if sometimes they didn't like it, they thought it was the right thing to do. So as a result, it was easy for the state to recruit grassroots activists for various state-led projects. So these projects were often politically neutral. For example, it could be a donation drive to help poor families buy school supplies, or a public campaign for road safety. But among the many civic-minded projects, state officials would also include those that were political. And usually they were related to the political support of the regional governor, or the United Russia Party, or Vladimir Putin. So this way, the regional authorities in the Kemerovo region and Tatarstan were able to create top-down, unity-based political machines. These machines were fueled by the energy of civic activists and the societal pressure on individuals to do the right thing, to support your team. So in these kinds of political machines, the political gets blended into the civic. And the political pressure goes through the same organizations and people that fulfill many public and community building functions, such as schools, neighborhood associations, pensioner clubs, etc. So these organizations work in their public capacity on an everyday basis. But during the election time, they are repurposed to work as political machines. Most people who participate in it don't even distinguish between these civic and political capacities. So I found a good example of such a unity-based political machine in the Kemerovo region. So the capital of the region, Kemerovo city, had a network of community centers and residential councils. A residential council in Russia in general, not just in Kemerovo, it is a small group representing the residents of a certain area that comes together to work on various neighborhood issues. It has some limited legal rights that allows those councils to do things about local infrastructure, to negotiate with utility companies and so on. And many Russian cities have at least a few of such councils in neighborhoods with particularly active citizens. So, but some cities have a lot more of those councils than in others. The Kemerovo city is the absolute champion among the Russian cities in terms of the number of residential councils. For 500,000 population in 2016, it had more than 7,700 councils. These 7,760 councils were comprised of almost 24,000 volunteer activists, which means that every 23rd person in the city was an activist of a residential council. So why so many? Turns out that the development of this organizational network was spearheaded by the city government. The city administration began creating residential councils in 1997. And they did it by reaching out to the most active citizens in the neighborhood and suggesting to put together such a council that could work with the city administration on various local issues. And the people in Cairo generally thought it was a great idea. So after creating a few hundred of these councils, the city administration probably realized it was getting too difficult to stay in touch with all of them. So in 3 to 4 years, they also started creating community centers, increasing their number to 47 by the late 2000s. These community centers were supposed to serve as a link between the residential councils and the city administration, and they were staffed with salaried municipal employees. So what did these community centers and residential councils do? So they did pretty much all kinds of community work you can think of. They organized cleanup Saturdays to make the neighborhood look good. They organized holiday celebrations and sports competitions. They supported hobby clubs and children's activities. They organized donation drives for families. They organized public lectures on various topics, from local history to legal and health issues. And this is an incomplete list. In the process of their work, community centers were always in touch with the city administration. And city officials sometimes participated in the events and frequently used the community centers as an organizational basis to get feedback from the population and to communicate their own messages. And here, of course, it gets trickier, because it was not only the city officials who used the community centers to organize town halls, but also the current deputies from the United Russia Party running for re-election. And needless to say, the political opposition was never able to use community centers for the same purposes. So these community centers also helped the authorities to monitor discontent and to co-opt the most active citizens before they had a chance to join the organization. The opposition organization. So during the elections, community centers and residential councils helped to campaign for the governor or for Putin or for the United Russia Party and mobilize the loyal voters. So the same residential councils and community centers that worked for the public good and community building also worked as political machines by blending political capacities into the civic ones. So now let's have a look at what happened in the regions below the regression line, where political machines were less relevant. There, the situation was the opposite. People viewed the state as an outsider at best or a predator at worst, not as their team leader. And that's because their teams were different. Usually it was some kind of a local community or a clan or an ethnic group. In Altai, for example, it was indigenous clans. In the Rostov region, it was different ethnic communities and Cossacks who have very strong identity. So in these regions, the right thing to do for the people was to cooperate with the leaders of these non-state communities, that is, their informal leaders. And people would not cooperate if state officials asked them to do something, but they would do it if their informal leaders asked for the same thing. So what happened when state officials needed people's cooperation? Well, they had to negotiate with the informal leaders because those were the only people to whom the other people would listen. So these informal leaders would start bargaining with the state. Say state officials asked to support Putin's candidacy at the election, or some candidate from the United Russia. These informal leaders would ask for something in return for their community. For example, in Altai, I heard in one of my interviews, they asked for a minivan. In another instance, in the Rostov region, they asked to renew a water pipe system in the village. So these informal leaders played the role of brokers, and the bargains with multiple brokers added up to a clientelism-based political machine. So such machines heavily depend on the ability of the ruler to either satisfy the material demands of the brokers or to have enough repressive capacity to silence the communities that would not cooperate. So these machines are about buying loyalty and repression, not about civic duty and teamwork. So let me now talk about the example of this bottom-up clientelism-based political machine. So I'm going to read a quote from an interview with a former municipal official in the Rostov region. He recollected how he tried to convince the people in one of the villages to sign up for some municipal initiative. And people would not agree until their informal leader told them to do so. I quote, "In Sovietsky district where I worked, there is a village Stepanovskaya, 11,000 people. It was impossible to get their cooperation on anything. Even during the Civil War, Budyonny was extremely surprised that this village was not burned down. He just couldn't do anything with it, and it remains the same today. I tried to obtain community support on different issues, gathered them in a public hall. It was packed, there weren't enough chairs, and I spoke for a long time trying to convince them until I almost lost my voice. They applauded. I get out and they say, 'Thank you. Everything you said was right. But we, Stepanovцы, are not going to do that. We are going to do exactly the opposite. But you just agreed. Well, we simply felt bad for you.' I could not understand what they needed. But then it occurred to me that I should have dealt with the informal leaders. It was either an ataman or the head of a block committee. I began to work through them. They repeated my words exactly, including commas and periods, and were immediately cheered by the people. Everything gets done, and you don't need any gatherings and discussions. I tell him, say in your own words, and everything gets done in 3 seconds. Any issues, social ones, and even fundraisers. The authorities should not try hard to convince people. You may be 1,000 times right and convincing, but they're not going to do it anyway. But if their own person says it, they will go over and above." So, end quote. So this illustrates how people would cooperate with their own community leaders, but not with state representatives, whom they do not consider their own. So now let's see how the two models that I just described translate into more theoretical terms. So the argument in the existing political science literature goes approximately like this. Here's an autocrat, and here's an individual. And most existing theories think of their relationship as driven by perks and punishment, or by buying loyalty and repression. This is a kind of contractual relationship between two autonomous parties, each of which is trying to maximize its utility. And oftentimes this is a zero-sum game. I win, you lose. I lose, you win. And another thing that is also known in the literature is that besides this relationship with the autocrat, people also have their informal communities. And the relationship of individuals with these communities is very different. These communities are important for their identity, for their understanding of where they belong. They expect a safety net from this community and pay back with loyalty. Here the logic is the logic of teamwork. We either lose together or we win together, like in a family. So this is very different from the utility maximization attitude. And this schema certainly works, but only for the cases below the regression line, for the Rostov region and Altai, where the political machines were less reliable. So the question now is, how can we adjust the schema to reflect what I observed in the cases above the regression line, where the political machines were more reliable? So we still have the autocrat and the individual. What is different, though, is the position of the group. If in the previous model, the group was separate from the autocrat, now it is positioned together with him. The autocrat is viewed as the leader of the group to which the individual belongs. And accordingly, the relationship of the individual with the group is also projected onto the autocrat. It's not the utility maximization contract anymore. It is a relationship of group loyalty. So resistance to the autocrat in this situation is difficult, not only because people may be materially dependent on the regime or be afraid of overt repression. Many also feel like they will betray the country if they turn against its leader. They do not separate the nation from the state. And this is one of the main roots of the seeming obedience of Russians. So what are the implications of these two models of authoritarianism for our understanding of democracy? I argue in my book that democracy is not a pole on the scale between democracy and authoritarianism, but rather a point of balance between strong society and the strong state. And admittedly, this is not a new idea, but we rarely analyze what happens when the system leans one way or the other. So if the state is weak, then the political regime is prone to develop into a division-based authoritarianism. In this situation, different factions in society tend to tear it apart, divide into them and us, and undermine the provision of the public good, bend the rules in their favor. To democratize, such societies need to build national unity, to develop more solidarity, generalized trust, and the idea of equality before the law. So the national unity will strengthen the state and bring the regime closer to democracy. If society is weak, though, and the state is strong, then the regime tends to develop into a unity-based authoritarianism. Here, there is a lot of national unity, but very little separation of the nation from the state. Since the state is the people's nation, they are unable to prevent their own state officials from abusing society and becoming the privileged class. And the path to democratization for such a society is different. It already has a lot of national unity, but it needs to separate the nation from the state. People need to learn that they can trust leaders who are not associated with the state and who can maintain institutions of accountability, such as a functioning parliament, and limit the power of the state, prevent overreach. So if we have both of these conditions, a unified nation and then a nation separate from the state, they will make democratic institutions function properly. Russia as a whole leans heavily towards the unity-based authoritarianism. And in the last chapter of my book, I explore this Russian unity-based authoritarianism in historical perspective. Here I will only give you a brief teaser to conclude my talk. So the central idea of the chapter is that the main tension driving Russian state-society relations and domestic politics is the conflict between the ideal of a just state and the reality of the repressive state. And a good metaphor to understand this conflict is probably an abusive parent. Like, a child abused by a parent usually does not want to separate from that parent. They just want to turn that parent into a kind one. In the same chapter, I outlined 3 reactions to this conflict between a just and repressive state. The first one is compliant activism, when people just deny the reality of the repressive state. Second one is passive resistance, when people psychologically shield themselves from state abuse with skepticism and moral relativism. The third one is active resistance, when people give up their ideal of a just state and develop alternative collective identities. So please read the chapter, read the book, and thank you for listening to my talk.
Thank you. So I'll kick off the discussion, and again, I encourage everybody to read the book because it's just full of a wealth of qualitative and quantitative evidence in defense of Natalia's points. I want to talk a little bit maybe about the democratization element to this, and the kind of feasibility of unifying really divided societies behind a single nation, and whether or not that is necessary for democracy to work, or whether or not democracy is designed to function in places, the only type of government that can function effectively in places that are potentially divided, because it allows for pluralism and a lot of other different channels. And then kind of building on this idea of like, is a strong state good for democracy or bad? Because it does seem that you make an argument in the book that weakening the state, or at least the state's fusion with nation is the way you put it, but also in the book, also kind of weakening the state's tentacles or repressive apparatus, we might read into a little bit more, might enable a stronger society to come up from the bottom. But weak states also are associated with democratic failure in that way. Is there a way to salvage a strong, capable bureaucracy that is responsive and that the leaders care about organization, but also understand that society will punish them when they step out of line and is open to alternatives and wants turnover and power? Like, where does this tension come from? Like, I imagine you're going to point to this plot and say, it's a balance. But how do we unify divided societies that are not unifiable? And do we really want to discard the state on the way to democratization, knowing that weak democracies fail?
Thank you for this $1 million question.
Well, I wanted to use the one opportunity that I had to get you talking.
Yeah. So I think the first part is actually easier to answer because the unified nation is absolutely necessary for democracy. You do need pluralism, but then if you don't have an agreement on basic institutions and basic rules and basic principles, then you end up in a situation of war of all against all, I guess. No institutions at all, no social order that discredits everything. So basically, you absolutely need pluralism, but you need a good institutional foundation for which you do need some agreement in society, some strong basis. And usually it comes with a common identity that overpowers more temporary disagreements, I would say. So, we don't have to go too far away. We can look at the United States and the history of the United States, right? How it used to be a pretty divided, still pluralistic, political arrangement, but probably not what we call a liberal democracy. And then over the course of the 20th century, through 2 world wars, right, the national identity really developed. And that served as the foundation of good functioning institutions that is now being eroded. The second part of the question is more difficult to answer because I admittedly I'm not a historian. I will be happy if there are any historians in the room and can point me in the right direction where to look for historical precedents. But the only precedents of how the strong state was counterbalanced, strong state that was formed first and then it was counterbalanced with political pluralism. The only examples I can think of are related to the nations that lost in the Second World War. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure exactly, it's just not going to happen to Russia in any observable future. The scenario is not feasible. How else it's going to happen? Maybe there is a way. We just haven't had a historical precedent of that, right? That's one answer. And another kind of small point to that, one thing I argue in my book is that those social norms that produce these loyalty patterns, this feeling of which group is yours, they are very, very sticky. They're extremely sticky. They develop over at least decades, but probably hundreds of years, centuries. So, unfortunately, people may be doing very right thing for democracy in Russia now, but we may not see the effect for a very long time, and that is always undermining the energy of the people who are doing it, right? When you're not seeing the result right away.
Thank you. Great way to kick things off. I want to open it up for some questions, and I'm happy to chime in later. Please introduce yourselves.
Evgeny Russian Center for European Policy Analysis. Tasha, thanks a lot for fascinating. It's all fascinating. my question is perhaps would be on the devil's advocate spectrum, is when you showed us the chart, it occurred to me that the four cases you selected,
Okay.
correlate with no, perhaps the graph of the distribution of costs, yeah.
Sorry.
They also correlate with another variable. Is Tatarstan and Kemerovo are one of the wealthy regions in Russia. They both have a very strong industrial base, and they are rich with natural resources. From the 90s, they experienced a fierce competition of various groups struggling for power. So Kemerovo became known for Tuleyev's rule and the clan associated with him, while Tatarstan is known for Shaimiev's clan politics. While Rostov and Altai are one of the poorest regions in Russia. While Rostov would be in the cohort of 40th, 50th place, while Altai is even poorer than Rostov. So basically you're dealing with rich regions and poor regions. And in the rich regions where clans monopolize the power, they can afford to invest in the institutions to provide for basic needs, for entertainment, to buy loyalty and stuff. So my question is whether, the types of authoritarian dynamics you see in those regions are not explained by the same competitive logic that you started with. It's just that, in the richest regions, the more successful clans monopolize power. It is still, the same kind of competitive authoritarianism. It's just that one group took over the other. While in the poorer ones, it's competitive, authoritarianism with many groups still there, but they simply don't have the basis that could provide grounds for one group, to emerge as dominating. If you know what I mean.
Yes.
So perhaps if you look at a different perspective, it's not the society that matters, when you explain the types of authoritarian models, but the resource base, natural curse perhaps, explanation and such.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and definitely one of the alternative explanations that I had in mind, because when I launched myself into this field work, I honestly had no idea what I was going to find. So, well, first I did have the regional product in the regression, and it wasn't significant. It wasn't really explaining things. Just the basics of the quantitative analysis. And I think it really just so happened that I picked the regions that are richer or poorer, because I only had to pick so many, right? So there is a little bit of truth in terms of where there are like large industrial complexes, they tend to have more money, but that would not explain anything that I saw on the ground at all. I even challenged some of the officials in the Rostov region to ask them why wouldn't they do the same thing as I saw in Kemerovo region. They never said it was the money that prevented them from doing it. They never said, well, if we only had the opportunity to do that, we would absolutely go for it. No, for them it was inconceivable. That's not how they do things. I was like, why don't you reach out to big business and ask them to provide all those social goods? And the person was like, that's pressure. We don't do that. It's not something that the state officials in these regions or society in these regions consider acceptable. Society in these regions also, representatives of all kinds of informal groups, small organizations, they totally guard the border between their own organization and the state. They would not allow municipal officials to be on board, for example, while in Cameroon it's just like, yes, of course they are. That's just the natural way of how things happen. Isn't it good? I have a very interesting example in the book from one private university in Tatarstan. And private universities, universities in general are federal jurisdiction, not regional one in Russia.
Depending on the status, there are different ones.
Probably, but that was a university, it's like a higher education establishment. They are in federal jurisdiction. All universities in Kazan, or in Tatarstan, I would say, they all go to monthly, at least when I was doing field work, they went to monthly meetings in the regional ministry that coordinated youth politics. And that wasn't because it was a formal requirement. They thought it was the natural way of doing things. They thought it was the way to build a system of, youth politics, youth whatever working with youth in the region. For them it was natural to be a part of something bigger that is spearheaded by the regional government. That's absolutely not how people think in Rostov and Altai. That is just a foreign way to think for them. So it's not a question of money. In Rostov, for example, one person who was in charge of youth politics in the city of Rostov told me how a lot of grants started coming from Moscow during the time when they tried to counteract the orange threat. So, and what's interesting, that person wasn't actually very loyal to the regime. Like, he used to work for some opposition structures and just ended up in the sitting government then. And he was like, yeah, all this orange threat, it was kind of a window dressing. We just got the money and used them for a bunch of local projects. So, that's how they think. Like, if you need us to pose for a few pictures about orange threat, fine, just give us the money. They don't think of themselves as part of a bigger project, of a bigger, line of work. While in Tatarstan and Cameroon, they actually do believe that they are part of something bigger and they benefit from it, not in this utility maximization way, but by being part of something bigger. It makes what they do more meaningful. It gives them more opportunities to develop these things. So it's really completely different way of thinking about the relationship with the state.
Thank you. I think I saw a hand on the right before. There were two hands. I know I wasn't making that up, but I guess not. Other questions? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Ellen Nikolava, a junior at George Washington, and I'm from Georgia, the country, so this was a very interesting topic to hear about. I have some Russian friends and we have gone into discussions about this topic, and it's interesting to see how people from different educational backgrounds, different economic backgrounds and different cities have different political views. And I want to know what research is out there, or what influences does migration and exposure to other systems and other types of governance have on people who have been a part of a systemic authoritarian regime.
Well, that's not exactly what I had an opportunity to kind of research while I was doing my own field work. So I know there is definitely this argument about, the linkage and leverage for democratization and the linkage to other countries at the level, some everyday level, right? Contacts that people have with other countries that has been shown to influence how people think about politics and the prospects of democratization. So I'm not sure that migration actually played into these things. And also regarding the level of education, I think most research that shows is not really supporting very much the hypothesis that more education means more democratic attitudes. That it's a lot more complicated. Maybe there is a little bit of correlation, right? But it's a lot more complicated because more educated people tend to come up with more complicated explanations for whatever beliefs they hold. So that's usually the case.